Hello, everybody. This is Mike Nelson from the Mike Nelson Show. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure to subscribe right now. We have over 600 subscribers around the world. I want to thank everybody for all their support. Today, I got the legendary drummer, Gene Hoglan, the Atomic Clock. How you doing today, Gene?
I'm doing well, Mike. How about yourself?
Doing good. It's an honor to speak, with one of my favorite drummers of all time. It's pretty crazy.
Well, thank you very much. The honor is mine. Absolutely.
All right. So when did your musical journey begin, Gene?
Well, gosh, probably when I was about two. That's when I discovered rock and roll. And my parents, like always like to tell the story about how there was a Santana song that had come on the radio, and that song was called "No One to Depend On." And I demanded that my folks take me to the record store and buy the 45, the little single of it. And that's probably where my musical journey started. And I just loved rock and roll from 1969 through 77 kind of thing, 76. I loved the American pop radio kind of approach, the AM pop radio and things like that. And then in 77 or so, I discovered FM radio and like a lot of the classic rock kind of things. And from there just led to me, getting totally into heavy metal. And by 1980, I was super into all the underground, like the new wave of British heavy metal movement that was happening. 1980 was a fantastic year for heavy metal, having, everybody from Iron Maiden to Judas Priest to Black Sabbath and all these fantastic bands releasing albums in 1980. I was hooked. And so by the time thrash metal was coming around and, going to see all these thrash shows kind of thing when I was a kid, I had decided that I wanted to be a drummer when I was 11 years old, and, listening to a lot of Kiss records and Rush and Tommy Aldridge and guys like Neil Peart and Tommy Aldridge and Peter Criss and guys like that just made me want to play drums for a living. And so that's when I set out on, I guess I am the poster child of living one's dream, because I set out on this path when I was 11 years old. By the time I was 13, I was locked in, like, yes, this is definitely what I want to do for a living, is play drums and, be in a kick-ass band or a number of bands or whatever. So that's when that all started.
So you never thought about playing like another instrument, like guitar or other instruments when you were a kid?
Well, I got forced with the piano lessons when I was like
Okay.
six or whatever. But after I'd been playing drums for a couple of years, after I got on the kit, I got my first drum kit at 13, and by the time I was 15, I remember, I'd had a number of friends who were guitarists. I remember I would ask them, like, I'd be over at their place and they'd be noodling on their guitar, and I'd be like, "Hey, man, can you play like an Egyptian kind of run or something on lead, or can you play this song by this band or whatever?" And after about 20 minutes or so, they'd look up and go, "Hey, what was that you wanted?" And I'd be like, "You know what? Tell you what, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna go grab myself a guitar from a pawn shop, a $10 guitar or something." And I had somebody loan me an acoustic, and that's when I started playing guitar. I was at age 15, and I've never stopped. So I played drums for 43 years or something like that now, and I played guitar for 41. So, and playing guitar, I always felt like, and I'll always tell anybody, like, definitely if you can play more than one instrument, you've widened your boundaries, and you're also able to communicate with your other band members in their language. Like if how Lars Ulrich writes music for Metallica by humming a riff to James, and James has to figure that thing out. I just cut out the middleman. It's like, well, here, if I got a riff for you, I'll play it for you. Here you go. And then, you learn it this way. And so you can communicate with your other band members in their language. That's got to be helpful. Totally.
So it seems like your drumming style has always been about feel. Do you feel like that's how it's been from day one? You're always about kind of getting that feel when you're playing the drums?
I think so, because I grew up listening to, even when drummers were technical back in the day, like I know Neil Peart was not the most technical drummer, but guys like Terry Bozzio, I mean, he had a lot of feel. Like you listen to a song like Presto Vivace from the live UK, what's it called, Night After Night. I mean, that's some crazy drumming, but there's a lot of feel to it. And another song like Alaska from the same record, the live UK record, you can find that on YouTube. I think they just released it on streaming services not
Wow.
that long. You couldn't find those albums on streaming at all. But stuff like that. Mark Craney from Gino Vanelli. I mean, he had all the technical chops in the world, but he was also super tasty. So that was one thing that I'm fortunate that I come from the era of where guys, I mean, speed was not that great of an issue back when I was growing up, playing drums. I mean, you had Cozy Powell playing double bass and Tommy Aldridge playing some double bass. And later on, you had guys like Rob Reiner from Anvil, Rob Wacko Hunter from Raven playing the kind of speed metalized double bass, Stephen Kaufman from Accept, Fast as a Shark, like that kind of double bass was yet to occur when I was, growing up playing. So I got to hone some, I guess, tasty chops, like taste and feel. Those are infinitely more important, like than technical prowess or speed or anything like that. God, if you could make the drums talk and sing and tell stories, that's a lot more exciting than the million guys that can play a million miles an hour. I mean, that's all great too. That's very aerobically challenging and that's fantastic, very athletic. But just for me, I like when drums tell a story. I'm really into that totally.
Now, maybe a lot of people don't know, but you used to be did you work lights for Slayer when you were young? You were a teenager, right? Working for
I
Slayer
did.
there?
Yeah,
I was
absolutely.
like
Yeah.
that. How was that?
That was real fun. It just kind of came about because, I used to go see all the Slayer shows and I was pals with those guys. I was pals with the Dark Angel guys. I mean, I grew up in the LA club scene. I started going to the clubs when I was 13 years old and I didn't look 13. I was 6 feet tall and had the dark glasses and all that kind of stuff. So I looked essentially the way I do now at 13. But I just gotten to know this. I was going to every Slayer show, and one night, uh, Tom came up to me and said, "Hey, man, our light guy isn't going to be here tonight. Do you think you can, that light board over there? You think you could figure that thing out and run lights for us?" And it had like 8 buttons on it. It was like the size of an iPad. Really, it was a tiny little machine with 8 buttons on it. And I was like, I can figure this out totally. And so I went and did lights for him, and it did a good job, I guess. And then the next week, that because Slayer was playing once or twice a week for forever here in town, and they weren't a very well known band. They were heavy as all hell, but not a lot of people knew them or appreciated them because they were so heavy. That's why I loved them. Um, the next week, exact same situations. Like our light guy can't be here tonight. How do you want to go run that board for us? And so it just got to the point where I would show up at the shows. I'd go straight to the light board and I just, do lights for them. And then when it came time they were hitting the road, you know, they had Tom, I remember, had to come speak to my parents to allow me to go on the road. And, he's like, you're a minor, like got to get your parents' permission. So I went on the road at age 16 with Slayer, and that was pretty cool. I made my vinyl debut on Show No Mercy, the evil, has no boundaries chorus, evil. One of those voices is mine, so. And I was 15 when we did that. So that's pretty cool.
High school kid on a Slayer album. That's pretty crazy, man.
Yeah, right. It's the second thrash metal album in history. Holy Jesus, how cool is that? I'm definitely OG thrash, I tell you.
Now, how did you end up on Dark Angel?
Well, after that Slayer run, Dark Angel was looking for a drummer, and one thing that I was also doing for Dave Lombardo on the tour was I was playing Dave's sound checks for him, and just so Dave could go, stand out in the front of house by the sound man to hear what the band sounded like. It's like that's kind of a rarity. The drum, a guitarist, sure, they're wireless. They get to go out there and go, or vocalists, got a wireless mic out there, hearing what it sounds like out in the house. Drummers rarely get to do that. So I was like, hey Dave, I'll play your stuff for you and just go out in front of the house and see how you like your drum sound, see how the band sounds. And I was also he was learning the double bass at the time, and I was just trying to give him some tips and pointers and things that were helping me to learn it, as well. So we were drum pals, and after the tour, Dave had asked me, he's like, hey man, how would you feel about, sticking around with us and going on the road with us and just being my drum tutor? And I was like, well, that's a killer offer, that's very cool. But, I want to do what you're doing. I want to play in a band. So, I don't know how much I could do both, so, so it wasn't too long after that tour that Dark Angel was looking for a drummer. And I remember Jim Durkin called Kerry King and said, hey, I know Gene was playing some stuff with you guys, how is he as a drummer? And Kerry was like, good drummer, whiny kid, but good drummer. So there you go. I guess I was whining a lot on that tour, but shit, I didn't know. I was 16 years old, man. But yeah, so I got the recommendation from Kerry that, to Jim, said, yeah, man, that guy can handle your material pretty good. So there you go. And that's pretty much how that happened.
Now, your first record with the band was Darkness Descends. Thoughts on its impact, on heavy metal? Because I mean, it's still, 40 years, it's going to be almost 40 years now this album came out, but people are still talking about it.
God, Lord almighty, 40 years. Yeah. Jesus, that's crazy. Yeah, I guess so. 86. Yeah. What are we,
2023?
23? Yeah. We're at. Okay, good. Holy Jesus, 40 years, man. 37 years. Well, yeah, we're very fortunate. I will always say that we're very fortunate that people still talk about the record and talk about its impact. And at the time, and so many other people have said this about their histories. Like, at the time, you have no idea what this is going to do, but looking back on it later, it looks like this well-designed plan. And it wasn't. We just tried to write the coolest record we could, the heaviest record we could. And just the fact that it's had whatever impact it's had over the years is pretty awesome. I've talked to a million folks in a million kick-ass huge bands that have said Darkness Descends was my jam. It's like I loved Slayer, Metallica, and Megadeth, and all Anthrax, and all the guys that were coming out. But Darkness Descends was the super special one for me, and so that's pretty darn cool. So the fact that we get to go out and play some shows and haul the entire album out on stage, that's pretty cool. We've never done that before, so that's some of the things that Dark Angel is up to currently, is playing the entire Darkness Descends in its entirety. That's pretty damn fun, and but just having its impact be felt. Oh God, Jesus, I remember when in 1988 when Metallica's One was coming on the radio and stuff, and I was getting calls from my friends going, hey man, do you hear Darkness Descends in One? And I'm like, what is One? I hadn't heard the song yet, but I got to hear a whole ton of folks going, holy Jesus, that's like those guys are listening to you guys quite a bit. So yeah, man, we won Metallica a Grammy with that album. So way to go, Dark Angel.
Now, with the recent passing of Jim Durkin, how has that, how's that affected the band? Or, talk about his legacy, as a musician.
Well, Jim is he is one of the original godfathers of thrash, absolutely. Like, geez, when I was on the tour with Slayer, I remember Jeff Hanneman. He wasn't talking to me, he was talking to somebody else. I forget who it was, but he was just going on and on and on about Dark Angel. And I knew Dark Angel. I love Dark Angel. I wasn't quite understanding how Hanneman was like really losing his mind. He's like, dude, you don't understand. They got some new songs, because I'm like, I know their stuff. I mean, dude, you're in Slayer. Like, what are you talking about? He's like, they got a couple new songs that, just not just I forgot how he heard them, but maybe he was at one of the rehearsals or something. But he's telling me about Perish in Flames and the Burning of Sodom. And those came about in summer of '84. And when I went to, I started working for Dark Angel, those were a part of their, new set. And, it's just like, God dang, Jim Durkin was writing the most intense, ripping, like, Jim is an absolute, he was my biggest influence on guitar, like, just, I learned, like, my thrash metal guitar style is Jim Durkin's style. I do everything the way Jim does. So, his loss was a, a real tragedy to us all. It was an absolute surprise. We did not we knew Jim had some health issues, but we did not expect him to be taken from us. And so, we found out very, very late in the game that Jim was no longer with us. And that, he had already set up Dark Angel's future without him. Like, he chose Laura Christine himself. That was completely 100% Jim's choice. And she's got the talent to take over for Jim, absolutely. But Jim's musical legacy will always honor that. And yes, obviously there was a time back in, the late '80s through the early '90s where Jim was not with us. We had Brett Erickson, we had Chris McCarthy, and Dark Angel was able to continue without him. But then when we got back together, of course it's Jim, and he's our brother, and his songwriting impact, impacted me, impacted a whole lot of folks as well. So, we just hope to do Jim's memory proud, honor his legacy of his great riffs and his great music. So that's, but Dark Angel will always, Jim will always be a part of us, even though for the last year or so of shows, he's not been our live guitarist. He always loved writing. He always loved, we loved working on material together. So that was pretty cool. So, we'll always keep Jim very strong in our hearts. Absolutely. Big time.
Now, back in those days, Dark Angel was putting out albums and touring. Overall, do you think those were they good memories? Back in the '80s, out the whole period there with Dark Angel.
Oh, huge time. That nothing but good memories. It was the Wild West. Absolutely. There were no rules. There were no laws. It's just like, write the heaviest, coolest material you could, and there weren't rules about what your vocalist had to sound like. Oh, that guy's not death metal enough or anything. It was just like, God, you'd have a screaming screecher like a Don Doty or a Mille Petrosa or a Schmear from Destruction, that screechy kind of vocalist. But then you'd have a vocalist like Caton DePena from Hyrax, who had a great voice, very soulful voice. You'd have singers like Fleming Ronsdorf from Artillery, one of my favorite metal vocalists. He was not a death metal guy. He had a crazy voice. It sounded awesome. Guys like Brian Troch, I guess Troch, from Cyclone Temple, just a lot of those great vocalists. But then you'd have a screamer like the guys from Macabre, like Corporate Death and well, Lance, the guys from Macabre, great vocalist. Jeff Becerra, holy Jesus, like that was amazing. Like those days of Dark Angel and Exodus and Possessed and Slayer, in the clubs, and even Metallica in the clubs and all that stuff. That was those such magical times that it again, you could, if you look back at something, it looks like there was a well thought out design to it, but there wasn't. There was just no rules. Everybody just write the heaviest, coolest stuff you could. All the crowd coming out to the shows going psychotic every night. That was just a really cool thing. And I was definitely a metal elitist. I was one of those guys. It's like I grew to hate the LA, the hair metal scene, all that sort of stuff. That's where thrash metal was born from, just a middle finger to all those, all those fist banging rockers, the hair metalers and stuff. So I was super into it, man. Totally.
Now you talk about, it was the Wild West, no rules. Do you think that's why metal? Why was metal still so underground though? Like what prevented it from going mainstream back in those days? Because we know in the '90s it kind of went a little mainstream, but why not in the '80s?
Because it took the '80s underground to create the '90s sort of acceptance of it. Took a good 10 years of all those aforementioned bands doing what they did, Overkill and guys like that, just of all the bands doing the underground music that was creating the buzz and creating the, well, you know what, I used to listen to Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, but now I want to find something a little heavier because my tastes are going heavier. Oh, Metallica, Ride the Lightning just came out, that kind of thing. That's where all the bands that came before us were a good gateway to the underground of the thrash metal movement and the nascent death metal movement. But there was, and it took a while for it to kind of crawl out from the sewers, but it did, and that's why when all the bands from the '90s that were doing their thing and were able to survive in the '90s, all the Panteras and Sepulturas and Biohazards and Typo Negatives and the bands like that. Thrash metal was the biggest influence on all of that. Like it wasn't, hair metal was dead, killed, crushed. They did it to themselves, and that's why the strength of thrash metal and thrash metal's influence and power and respect and sustainability. If you're playing thrash metal, there's nothing fake in that. Well, a lot of bands can fake it, but I mean, just it came from such a pure place of like, we just want to write extreme music. We don't like Motley Crue and Rat and Warrant and Autograph and all those things. Yeah, we dug Judas Priest back in the day, but now Judas Priest is putting out stuff like Turbo. That's not to our taste anymore. So we just want to find and create the new extreme thing. And that's where when thrash metal was no longer hip, and death metal took over, thrash metal just kind of went above ground with the Panteras and Sepulturas and Ministry with thrash metal, for God's sake. Like, God, I would never saw that coming back in 1986. But there you go. So thrash metal was a powerful style of music, and its tendrils were long reaching. Absolutely.
You think the success of the Black Album from Metallica was why metal got so big in the '90s and grunge and all that, or do you think what was it mainly you think it attributed to that period?
Well, that album became the biggest selling. Is it the biggest selling metal album
I'm
in
pretty sure it
history?
is around the world. Yeah,
I
yeah,
would imagine it is. Yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, and for those who might, maybe Metallica was a little too extreme for the average Motley Crue fan or Rat fan. That album made, heavy music palatable for a lot of the folks that like, and Justice for All, that's a little too extreme. Master of Puppets, a little too extreme, let alone, Rain in Blood or Darkness Descends or anything. That's just way out there for the rockers. But Metallica went rock, and it was, cool and hip to like Metallica for everybody. And, that's arguably Metallica's biggest song throughout history is a heartfelt ballad. I think Nothing Else Matters. I think that is probably the most wide-reaching Metallica song that goes across musical genres for people. I mean, you hear country covers of it. You hear, you know, just pop bands covering it. So, um, but that, the Black Album made the heavier style of music come across to an audience that might not have had the interest in it before. But hell, I mean, you look at grunge, like grunge, absolutely influenced by thrash metal. Nirvana, huge time
Yep.
influenced by thrash metal. I remember Byron from Strapping. He was pals with Kurt Cobain, and I'm pretty sure it was Kurt Cobain who turned Byron onto Darkness Descends.
Wow.
When I first heard the Bleach advanced cassette that I got, I'm like, this is a thrash band. This is
Yeah.
like an odd, and there was no grunge at the time. There was Soundgarden had the FOP EP and the Ultra Mega OK kind of thing out, and that I thought was pretty heavy, like, and then like Negative Creep from Nirvana, that's a thrash song. There's a lot
Yeah.
of thrash elements in Nirvana, and then it comes out, later after Dave Grohl joined. Dave Grohl's a huge thrash fan, a huge metal fan. So, that's where thrash metal, boy, its fingers reached everything. I felt, I remember talking to Lane Staley when I met Lane Staley with Terry Date. Terry Date introduced us, and Lane was like, dude, I'm a huge Dark Angel fan. I saw your show in Seattle, a few months back, and that was the greatest show ever, and that was the night that I met Kim from Soundgarden. Kim had come out to the show, and so a lot of the grunge guys were definitely, had their fingers on the pulse of what was heavy. And grunge, it sounded closer to thrash than it ever did Motley Crue or Rat or anything like that. So I always felt grunge was absolutely influenced by thrash metal, big time.
Now, how did you wind up on Death?
Well, after Ron Reinhardt came to Dark Angel and said, guys, I can't do the music industry anymore, man. I got to step aside. And I took the same kind of approach where I was like, well, Ron is stepping aside, and I just don't have the energy to go through another vocalist search for Dark Angel. So, Dark Angel guys, if you want to carry on Dark Angel, by all means, please do so. But I think I'm going to step aside right now too, and I'm going to see where I can start going with my playing, my career, my whatever. And it was pretty much right around the same time when I got a call from Borovoy Kurgan, who was, the man who runs Blabbermouth. Boy has always been a great networker. He's deeply involved in the metal scene, obviously, and deeply involved in the tape trading scene. And you could always appeal to Boy, like, hey, man, I'm starting a new thing. I'm looking for a vocalist. And that's what I was doing with Boy at the time. I was reaching out to him to see if he could find me like the perfect voice for my new project that I was putting together at the time. And he called me one day and said, look, I was just speaking with Chuck, and looks like Chuck is looking for a drummer. And, you're looking for a new project to be a part of. So do you guys want to get together and have a chat and see where this could lead? And so Chuck and I did. And before we knew it, we were putting together the individual thought patterns, album. So Chuck had sent me a riff tape, and a couple of weeks, we set up a time for me to come out to Florida and start working on this. And he sent me this riff tape, and I had it for a week or so. And I just came up with a bunch of drum parts in my head, kind of thing. And when I got out to Florida, set up a rehearsal, and we just started right on the individual thought patterns material. However many songs were on individual, I think there was 10. He had sent me 10 songs on a riff tape, and I just put together some mental drums in my head. And then before you knew it, we were in the studio tracking that damn thing. So there you go.
How was it like recording such a complex album, which was individual thought patterns?
Well, it was, that's a good question. God, because I'm thinking about the actual complexities of it. And we were pretty well rehearsed. We only had 3 weeks, but it went pretty quickly. And God, I remember tracking the song Overactive Imagination. And I remember Donald Tardy had stopped by the studio. We recorded at Morris Sound in Tampa, the Tampa area. And Donald Tardy had stopped in, and everybody was stopping in. Tons of folks were just coming in, hanging around. I remember tracking Overactive Imagination while looking at Donald looking at DT in the control room there, just hanging out, checking it out. And that was pretty fun. But it was a kick-ass session. It was myself and Chuck for the most part, and Stevie D was there, but Stevie D had been brought into the project again, very late in the game. Chuck and I had already been working on the material, and all of a sudden, and I knew Chuck had a bassist by the name of Scott Carino, who had done his Human era touring with him. All of a sudden, just Chuck came to me one morning and said, look, Scott is not going to be working with us. I'm going to be getting Stevie D out here. I was like, kick ass, great. Steve and I had known each other for a number of years. Sadis was always playing with Dark Angel up in the Bay Area. When we play, we'd always have Sadis open for us. So we were pals from way back in the day. And, and then getting to work with Steve. And that was, I had to talk with Stevie D recently. I'm not sure if Individual was the very first time that he used the fretless bass. I think he might have used it on something else beforehand, maybe, because I know he had done some Autopsy records as well. I think he had done, but anyway, first time seeing a fretless bass being used on a metal album, that was pretty darn cool. And so what happened was Stevie D came out. I tracked the drums, and what Scott Burns felt would be the best idea was, Steve, take Gene's drums back to California with you, while we're doing the guitar and Chuck's vocals and the leads. We'll get Andy out and all that kind of stuff. You go home, learn the material and stuff. And so Steve got to rehearse to the actual drum parts. That's why it was so locked in. Steve was saying, he's like, yeah, man, I just got to really focus, on what you had laid down, and create parts directly to what were going to be going on the record. So that was pretty cool. And so, yeah, it was a kick-ass session, man, fully.
Now, did you feel that connection with Steve right away? You know, as a bass and drum connection, or did it kind of take some time?
No, instant,
Wow.
instant. And that was it because, and it was because he was writing kick-ass little fills and things to my little things that I would do, and he would be locked in with them so tightly that it just created this symbiotic relationship, fully like musical brotherhood, where we both, we both got each other. If he's doing something, I'm catching that, and if I'm doing something, he's catching that. And that's what made it really fun. Where, I mean, the rhythm section in heavy metal, and especially the more extreme style of heavy metal, that that was a phrase that just really did not exist. Like I mean, I think we were one of the original rhythm sections. I mean, Gar and Dave Jr. from Megadeth, that was a pretty good rhythm section there. But for the more extreme side of stuff, that, Steve and I were kind of it, and we played off each other quite a bit back in those days. So yeah, that was just great. And you know, the one thing about Steve is, and I've said this a million times, is like, yes, his technical proficiency is unsurpassed. He's one of the best technical players. He's got all the chops. He can play anything on bass. But the thing that separates Steve for me is his concept of writing bass lines. He writes the most musical bass lines and things that just really buttress the riffs so well. Because a lot of times, in the thrash metal, death metal kind of thing, the bass follows the guitar. And that's how I used to write bass lines. I didn't know what I was doing way back in the day. But Steve took that to a separate level of, guitars are doing this, bass is doing this, bass is playing with the drums. The drums are playing with the guitar more than the bass, but the bass is playing with the drums, and the bass is going to create a separate, structure of the arrangement. Steve DiGiorgio is a master of that. Absolutely.
So, like with the track, the philosopher, I mean that's an example of what you're talking about, right? With Steve and you kind of having that, very unique style. First time we'd ever seen that in extreme metal.
Right. Yeah, totally. And that big old jam session at the end, how cool is that? I remember Steve just saying, I think originally it was going to be a jam like, I think it was supposed to be like a trade-off lead thing with Andy and Chuck, but I think maybe they had already sent Andy home because Andy just came out to play some leads. And I think it was like one of those things, like Chuck and Steve had come back to lay his bass lines down, and Chuck was like, "Uh-oh, I forgot to have Andy lay down leads on this. So Steve, you take over, do some of your things here." And I
Wow.
think that's how that kind of came about. I think, don't quote me on it, but I think that's how that went down. But yeah, I mean, Steve he could, man, what a musical master that man is. That's the thing I love most about Steve is his musicality and the way he can construct a part that is, a bass line that is just, perfect.
Now with the next record, Symbolic, it's even more progressive. How was that album process recording similar or different? The Symbolic album.
Well, the difference in Symbolic was kind of the preparation. The Because I stuck around. I wasn't like a one and done with Chuck. We were still working, and Steve DiGiorgio was, like, I view Symbolic completely as a Steve DiGiorgio album, because Steve was a part of every single part of Symbolic, with the exception of the recording. And Kelly Conlon did a great job. I mean, Kelly did killer, but Steve was there for all the writing and all the demos and all that stuff. The only thing Steve wasn't a part of was the actual recording. So that was that's a Steve DiGiorgio record to me, but we had a lot of time, to let the songs flesh themselves out. And Chuck and I I spent a lot of time out in Florida putting Symbolic together. I had the time available to do it, and there wasn't a deadline looming like for individual thought patterns, where Chuck was like, "Oh, I'm pretty late in the game. I got to get this thing going." And so it's like, "Okay, let's just get this thing together really quick." Symbolic, we had the time to let the songs kind of breathe, and I think I think you hear that in the Symbolic material, is like it doesn't sound like a bull in the china shop where it's all like just rushed and crazy. It had it could kind of settle and sink in. The songs sound just not as manic as and I'm not meaning like tempos or anything, but there's just a kind of a rushed sort of quality, definitely to my drumming on individual, as opposed to Symbolic. Symbolic just had a little calmer approach, where you could flesh a lot of ideas out, and Symbolic sounded like a well fleshed out album, very polished record. And the fact that we used Jim Morris as opposed to Scott Burns. Not quite sure how that went down, or necessarily why. I think Scott was just kind of entering the final phase of his production career, I think, at that time. So I think that's why Chuck had opted for Jim Morris, one of the co-owners of Morris Sound. And the album sounded quite polished, and it was a killer record. And I've said this on a number of occasions, is that it was not necessarily well received when it came out. I mean, the reviews were all really killer for it, but the actual fans that were hoping for another Leprosy or Scream Bloody Gore or Spiritual Healing, or Human for that matter, I mean, Death was entering a new phase in their career, their genre defying career. Death was, Chuck was never comfortable with the nickname of the Godfather of death metal, because he's like, dude, there were guys doing this before me. Jeff Becerra is a big influence on me. I love Possessed. They're arguably the first death metal. Possessed created the term death metal. So Chuck was never real comfortable with being called the Godfather of death metal. But for all intents and purposes, a lot of people felt Death was the first death metal band. So, okay, if that's what the popular conception was, that Death created death metal, though it might not be true, but that's still the perception. Okay, Death and Chuck had a hand anyway in the creation of a new style of music. Then technical metal, they weren't the first doing it, but to some people, Human was the first technical metal record. Some folks might not have heard Watchtower or Atheist or anything like that, but Human was the first technical metal album a lot of people had heard. So Death created technical metal. Then Death helping create melodic death metal as well, with albums like Individual and especially Symbolic. I mean, it's one thing to create one genre, but help create three. Like, geez, way to go, Chuck, way to go, Death, way to go, us. Shoot, that's pretty cool.
Now, it would have been Chuck's birthday this past Saturday.
That's right.
What do you think was his impact on you and metal in general? Just talk about Chuck. What do you about your thoughts about him?
Well, his impact on metal is very apparent. Like there are, Chuck, to this day, he has a lot of fans, and there are a lot of folks out there that still, man, hell, just look at any battle jacket you see. You're going to see a death patch on that battle jacket. Absolutely.
All around the world. Yeah.
All around the world. Forever. That's in perpetuity. So that's pretty cool. Way to go, Chuck. His impact is definitely felt. Like Death has transcended just being an underground death metal band to I would not be surprised at seeing one of them Kardashians wearing a death letter, that kind of thing. So, that's pretty darn cool. And Chuck's impact on me is like we were all pals. Chuck taught us all patience. Taught us all a lot of patience. We love Chuck. He was our friend. Very complicated man, of course. And I remember when he broke up the band. He broke up Death on the Symbolic tour as an absolute act of defiance against the record label. And seeing your friend like fall on his own sword, commit seppuku or whatever, rather than be under the control of somebody else, that was a heavy moment, and so a lot of tears involved when Chuck was breaking up the band. He was upset with the record label, understandably so. The record label, he had a few caveats in place for the record label that the record label just kind of walked right over, right past. And Chuck was not about to take that sitting down. So he's like, I would rather break up my dream of a band than let somebody else try to dictate to me what I can do or what I can't do with my band. So I will destroy what I love rather than let somebody else destroy it slowly. So like kudos to Chuck. But we love the music, and that's why there's a Death to All. Shoot, man, one little Death to All shirt right here. Yeah, man. We love the music. We love Chuck, and we love the music, and we love being a part of this musical, dynasty or legacy or whatever. That it's super fun when Steve and Bobby and Max and myself, we get together to do some Death to All touring. We have a great time playing the material. There's 7 albums worth of 7 or 8. Is it 8? 7. Yeah.
I'm drawing a blank too.
Yeah. 5, 6, 7. 7 albums worth of material. And I mean, I suppose we could concentrate on the albums that we all did, but that's not a lot of fun for people, like do the entirety. That's why our show is 2 hours, 2.5 hours long sometimes, because there's so many songs, so many albums that you want to give a good tribute to each record. That we're not going to shortchange people by just playing 3 albums worth of material. That wouldn't work for us. I mean, Chuck had too many cool eras to just play, from Human until Symbolic kind of thing, whatever. But we really enjoy doing this, and the fans seem to really enjoy it as well. There's so many times when there's guys in the front row, like hardened, grizzled metal veterans, that have tears coming down their cheeks because they never thought they would see something like this again. They never thought they'd see Death music being performed by Death people. Of course, Chuck isn't there, but Max Phelps does an extremely admirable job at being, not emulating, but just representing Chuck's playing and his vocal styles. Chuck's vocal styles change from album to album, and Max is there. It's not like he has one voice through the entirety. He's changing them with each. There's 7 different voices from Max. And that's we enjoy doing it. So, and it's an important part of metal, the metal's legacy. Death, absolutely. So we just want to represent it in a real good way, and I think we do.
Yeah, you sure do. Yeah, I got a chance to see you guys play live a few months ago. It was great.
Cool, man. Excellent. Oh, that was the coldest night. Was that in Minnesota?
No, in LA. I hadn't moved out here yet. I was still over there.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
excellent.
Now, what about why were you not on the last death record?
Well, I, um, it was kind of funny is Chuck and I were writing that album, because we had, once we finished recording Symbolic, we went right to writing new stuff, and we didn't, Chuck didn't foresee Death disbanding a number of months later. So we were moving forward and writing what became the Sound of Perseverance record. And I tell you, I was taking the drums in an exact 180-degree opposite vein than Richard did. Like that was, it was like, okay, we've done the technical stuff, and let me try to really buttress your songwriting, Chuck, with some real solid drums. There were still going to be kick-ass drums, but it was not going to be psycho, over the top, throw the drums down the stairs, and like Symbolic for me. That was. Did I overplay on Symbolic? I think I did. But I was going to try to do take a different approach to what eventually became Sound of Perseverance. I remember when Sound of Perseverance came out, I was like, hey, I recognize this song. I recognize this song. I recognize that one. Hey, that one, that kind of thing. And boy, I was not doing any of this kind of drumming to this. But there you go. I think it was just I had moved on. Like I I'm not sure that I would have returned for that album, because I was so deep up in what I was doing at the time. I wouldn't have had time to come back for the Sound of Perseverance, because I was up in Vancouver, Canada, moving forward with Strappy Young Lad and all the Devin Townsend music. I was deeply entered my Vancouver, Devin Townsend, Strapping Young Lad phase of my journey or whatever. So that's one reason right there. And we all knew Richard from before. We all knew the guys from his Sound of Perseverance project. Steve DiGiorgio, also a part of Sound of Perseverance, everything up until the recording. Like that's Steve wrote a lot of those bass lines and stuff like that. So but yeah, that was I can see where Chuck was like, man, I just, every time we'd have to rehearse, I'd have to fly guys out. Let me find some local guys so I could put this together. And Chuck was really, really into, Control Denied. And I I remember I thought I had heard somewhere that it was kind of a like maybe a contractual obligation, like if you do this Final Death album, you can move forward with Control Denied. I mean, don't quote me on that, but I thought I had heard that. Steve DiGiorgio might be able to answer that a little better than I would, but there you go.
Now, with you've done various projects since Death. You played, of course, with Testament for a long time, one of my favorite bands. How was that like? Playing with one of the legendary thrash metal bands from the '80s.
Well, that was fine. That was cool. We're all pals and stuff, and it made they have a very well-oiled machine. Testament does. They get out there and do their thing, and I'm always pushing everybody to play heavier and play faster and that kind of thing. So that was kind of like, if I had any kind of influence on Testament, it's like, make the heaviest songs you can come up with, make the heaviest albums you can come up with. Like live, when it comes to playing live, we're an effing thrash metal band, like, and you guys have been playing thrash metal for 40 years now, like we could step all this up and play super fast and heavy, no problem, right? So that was one thing I tried to bring. And I always just tried to be just a cool bandmate, just show up, play well, and have a a good attitude, and just be pretty lighthearted at it. And so that's why having Testament, being able to do all the touring with them, having Death Clock on my plate as well, and all the Brendan Small material that I've worked with over the years, since from Death Clock on, that's been super exciting as well. So yeah, I love playing drums. I love playing drums for a living, and I've got a fantastic life. So I love getting out there and celebrating it live. Absolutely.
What's the status of the new Dark Angel album?
Well, we're going to be able to tell all Dark Angel fans some. We're going to let everybody in on some exciting news very soon, and there's a lot of people are going to be really excited and really happy, and I'm really excited and I'm really happy. So once we get to move forward on some newsworthy situations, the world's going to know about it, and hopefully they'll be excited as well. Man, absolutely.
What else is in store for Gene Hoglan in 2023 outside of
Well,
touring?
we've got these, like with the Dark Angel stuff, we're doing a number of Darkness Descends shows, and that's pretty fun. We just did Darkness in LA about a month ago. Holy Jesus, that was psychotic. Like the crowd,
I know I missed
it was
that
like
one,
we were
man.
in 1986, man. Were you at that show? Were
No,
you
I
there
wasn't. I
today?
missed that one. I was already over
Oh
here. So yeah.
God, Lord of mine. It was from minute one of the first song of the first night to the last minute of the last song on the last night. We did 3 sold out shows. Holy Jesus, that was just psycho, man. The crowd was like seriously, it was like 1986 all over again, man. Just bodies flying through the air. Just there's the energy was so amazing. So way to bring it Los Angeles, and New York City. That's our next one in a couple of weeks. So everybody in New York, come out to the Irving Plaza, and boy, come out and get your teeth handed to you. Let me tell you, that's pretty darn cool. And well, also pretty well known. Death Clock has a movie and 2 albums and a tour coming up for later in 2023. So looking forward to that. Once we get all the Dark Angel bit of biz out of the way, then that's one thing that we can keep on rolling forward with, and getting that Death Clock stuff going. That's awesome. Brendan just sent me the final mixes yesterday, and my God, this Death Album 4 is going to be incredible. The soundtrack album to the movie is going to be incredible. The movie itself is going to be incredible. The tour is going to be awesome. So everybody keep your eyes open. And the tour starts in late August and it goes through mid October. So there's a good chance Death Clock is going to be playing really near your town, man. So come out and check out a great show, man. It's going to be really cool.
What are your thoughts? You've been doing this for a long time. What are your thoughts on the metal scene today? How it's changed, or what do you think about which way it's going? Heavy metal music.
Well, it's I think the heaviness and the technicality of it, I think that is the most upfront things that are a part of today's the latest class of metal bands that are coming out. It's technical, over the top technical. That's pretty cool. And the heaviness, it's heavier than it's ever been. Like I will freely admit, I am not very up on what is like the Billboard charts and stuff, but I know that some of these like super heavy younger bands are hitting the top of the charts with really ball crushingly heavy music. So heavy metal's doing fine. Like there's room for everybody, and a band like Dark Angel can come out, come out and play shows. Bands like Death Clock, bands like Lorna Shore, like can come out with their Psychosis, Archspire, just like God, psychotic music, and people enjoy it. So more power to everybody, more power to all of heavy metal. Darn tootin'.
Now, last question here. What advice would you give young drummers out there?
Well, there are a number of things I could tell everybody. Make sure you do your stretches, like start stretching young, like a few guys have been able to get into their later careers and not stretched. And some guys can do okay, but stretch, wear leg weights. Hell, that's always helpful for the double bass. Relax when you're playing. All the heavier the music is, the more you should try to relax. Play with as many musicians as you can. Widen your spectrum, broaden your horizons. If you want to bring a style or an element to your playing that might not be looked at as cool or heavy metal, all the more reason to do it. Bring out those outside influences. Let yourself be influenced by everything, and that makes you a really well-rounded musician. Nothing wrong with that. Try to create the next level of drumming. That's what I always try to do. Try to elevate the concept of drumming, the entirety of drumming. Try to do that. Nothing wrong with that. There is no failure when you're trying to help redefine an approach. Absolutely redefine those approaches. Like change the course of drumming history. That's what I tried to do when I was younger, and who knows if I have, but that was my approach. Definitely.
I think you did.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So yeah, just and don't be afraid to learn another instrument. Pick up the guitar, pick up the bass, pick up the keyboards, all that sort of thing. And and these are all just from the musical standpoints, let alone all the business things that young musicians should know how to read a contract, know how to understand a contract. Legalese is a very simple, it is a simpler form of communication than one would think. All those big words that you see in contracts, learn what those words mean, because a lot of those words are knives pointed at your back, and make sure that you're properly armed for those knives. And young musicians these days, they understand the concept of branding and working there. A lot of guys in these young bands, they're already well off because they've taken the business aspect of things and the social media and learned how to utilize all things at your disposal to help create your career, create your path. Use everything that you can. Absolutely. So hope it didn't bombard everybody with too much information there, but there's a lot to be said for all of that. Absolutely.
All right, I want to thank you, Gene, for talking to you today. It was a great interview. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Stay heavy.